The Sudan Genocide, the conflict in Sudan explained. A brief background of the conflict. The current war in Sudan erupted on 15 April 2023 when the Rapid Support Forces, RSF, launched coordinated assaults across the country, targeting bases and key infrastructure controlled by the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF. The RSF, a powerful paramilitary organization with roots in the Darfur region, was officially established in 2013 from militia networks originally mobilized by the government to suppress insurgent groups during the Darfur conflict. The SAF, in contrast, represents Sudan's long-standing national military institution and has historically served as the dominant actor in the country's political hierarchy. What began as a confrontation between two security bodies has since evolved into a full-scale civil war and a struggle for control over the Sudanese state, its resources, and its political future. The humanitarian consequences have been devastating. Entire neighborhoods of Khartoum and other cities have been reduced to rubble, and millions of civilians have been displaced internally or forced to flee across borders. Reports of massacres, sexual violence, and deliberate targeting of hospitals and aid convoys reveal the degree to which the conflict has eroded the foundations of civilian life. As both sides entrench their positions, Sudan has become the stage for a wider contest of international interest, where regional and global powers alike contribute to the perpetuation of violence under the guise of stability, security, and influence. The Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, perspective. From the SAF's standpoint, it views itself as a legitimate national military entrusted with protecting Sudan's territorial integrity, law and order, and sovereignty. It positions the RSF's actions as illegitimate and destabilizing. The SAF sees the root of the conflict in attempts by the RSF to usurp authority over the security apparatus and to avoid integration or subordination to the state army. In other words, the SAF claims the RSF wants a state within a state. The SAF argues that failure to reform the security forces, including merging RSF into SAF, creates a dual power structure, which is dangerous for national stability. It sees itself as defending not only against the RSF, but also against broader fragmentation or collapse of central authority. The SAF retains air force and heavy weapons capabilities, though it suffers in manpower, morale, command, and logistics. It uses conventional military operations, recapturing key urban centers, airstrikes, siege, and encirclement operations. For example, the SAF regained control of central Khartoum in March 2025. The SAF has also fought to cut RSF supply lines, retake major cities, and restore government control over central Sudan. The SAF complains that without its operation, Sudan will slide into fragmentation, particularly given RSF's hold over much of Darfur and western regions. The SAF faces historical problems such as manpower shortages, issues of cohesion, a legacy of military regimes, and entanglement of the military in politics and economy, which complicates reform. The SAF is also criticized for its own share of civilian harm, obstruction of humanitarian aid, and for being part of a military political structure that has long had poor relations with civilian populations. Human rights organizations attribute serious violations to SAF forces as well. From the SAF perspective, the RSF's mobility and ability to control territory are challenging their monopoly of force. The army fears being hollowed out or marginalized if the RSF is allowed to dominate. Rapid Support Forces, RSF perspective. The RSF claims to represent an alternative power center, and from their perspective, the existing military and political system in which the SAF is dominant is unreformed, exclusionary, and needs change. They present themselves as modernizing and resisting a structure that keeps them subordinate. The RSF argues they should not just be folded into the SAF without protections for their command structure, status, and role. Their leader, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo Hamedi, has insisted on reforms, arguing that integration must wait until a more inclusive professional military is established. The RSF also frames the conflict as one over legitimacy and a political future. They announced the formation of a parallel government and a new Sudan charter, positioning themselves as an alternative to the SAF-dominated order. The RSF is highly mobile, uses light vehicles, rapid maneuvers, and paramilitary-style tactics rather than conventional heavy armor. It had significant territorial control early on, especially in Darfur and western regions. The RSF engaged in taking advantage of the fragility of the SAF structures, surprise operation in urban cities, for example Khartoum, and leveraged its networks, Darfur links, to secure bases in vast regions. On the political side, the RSF tried to capture legitimacy by setting up parallel civilian administration in areas it controls, suggesting a rival state structure. The RSF is widely criticized for human rights abuses, massacres, ethnic violence, especially in Darfur, obstruction of humanitarian assistance, and use of force against civilians. It lacks some of the institutional depth and legitimacy of a national army, and questions remain about its command structure, long-term governance capability, and ability to transition to peacetime roles. From the RSF's perspective, this might be a feature that they are a force for change, but for many observers, this is a vulnerability. With the SAF gaining momentum by 2025, the SAF seemed to have the upper hand in central Sudan, and RSF finds itself increasingly on the defensive in some regions. The enduring conflict. At the heart of this conflict is who controls the instruments of force in Sudan. The SAF wants a unified, state-controlled military apparatus. The RSF resists subordination and wants either to maintain autonomy or dominate. Each side claims to be the legitimate path for Sudan's future. SAF under Burhan versus RSF under Hameti in the new Sudan order. This means the conflict is not just military but political, and thus harder to resolve by battlefield alone. Control of key regions, infrastructure, airports, ports, cities, and supply lines matter. The RSF has held parts of Darfur before the SAF reclaimed central Sudan. The struggle is partly over who controls what. Both sides see and blame the other for atrocities, civilian harm, and humanitarian access issues. This intensifies the conflict, draws in international actors, and increases the complexity of any settlement. Each side has external supporters or opponents. The SAF is supported to some degree by neighboring states concerned about stability, and the RSF has been accused of having foreign backing or at least using external resources. This external dimension complicates negotiations because both sides see the future of Sudan in fundamentally different ways. Any settlement would necessarily require major restructuring of the security and governance system, which is very hard in a war context. The The conflict is nationwide, not limited to a frontier region, as Central Sudan, Khartoum, Darfur, Kordofan, for example, are all involved. That makes it harder to negotiate sector by sector. Humanitarian catastrophe and civilian suffering are both a consequence and a driver of escalation. Atrocities on both sides provoke retaliation, spill into ethnic dimensions, and complicate peace efforts. The external actors add another layer of interest and interference, which can prolong conflict. Finally, trust is very low. SAF fears RSF ambitions. RSF fears SAF repression. Any transition would need guarantees, but neither side fully trusts the other to abide by them. Key external actors supporting the RSF: the United Arab Emirates, Gold, Red Sea, and Horn of Africa influence. The UAE is widely cited as providing arms, logistics, and financial backing to the RSF. The trade-off is that the RSF controls large gold mining and extraction areas in Sudan, and the UAE gains access to gold exports, trade flows, and investment opportunities, especially through Dubai. The UAE also has strategic interest in the Red Sea and Horn of Africa region, including influence over port infrastructure and routes. Enabling a force like RSF gives them leverage. For the RSF, this support means greater mobility, access to weapons, and an external patron that helps sustain operations beyond purely domestic resources. However, the involvement also helps drive the conflict's escalation by creating external supply lines. Chad and some Sahel border actors, money and logistics. The RSF is reported to use Chadian territory, air and land routes for supply and logistics. Some reports tie Chad to RSF support, or at least to allowing RSF supply passage, often in connection with UAE interests. For the RSF, access through Chad broadens its operational logistics. For Chad, the alliance may earn financial or political benefits. Wagner Group Russia, gold and Red Sea trade routes. Early in the conflict, there was strong evidence that Wagner, a Russian private military company, provided arms training to the RSF, capitalizing on RSF control of gold mines and resource flows. Wagner had access to Sudan's mineral wealth and could secure a foothold on the Red Sea, especially via port deals, but backing a force like the RSF, which is more flexible and less tied to state structures. However, Russia's allegiance appears to have shifted over time. Key external actors supporting SAF: Egypt, regional stability, and refugee inflow. Egypt is frequently cited as one of the clearest backers of the SAF and General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan's camp. Sudan is Egypt's southern neighbor. Egypt has strategic interest in stability, or at least predictability, across its borders. Controlling refugee flows, regional security, access to the Nile, and ensuring that Sudan does not become a base for hostile actors benefits Egypt. For the SAF, Egyptian support gives political legitimacy, diplomatic backing, and likely material or training assistance. Turkey, gold and Horn of Africa trade routes. Turkey is cited as providing weapons, including drones, and military logistics support to the SAF. Turkey has growing ambitions in the Horn of Africa, wants to build military commercial ties, secure port and mining deals, and counter-rival the Gulf states, for example, the UAE. Supporting the SAF helps Turkey build those links. This gives the SAF access to relatively modern UAV remote sensing capability, which is significant in this conflict. Iran, Horn of Africa, Red Sea trade routes, and influence. Iran is reported as supporting the SAF, or at least having cooperated with SAF in drone and military supply. Most likely, Iran seeks influence in the Red Sea and Horn of Africa, possibly using Sudan as a backdoor to project maritime and regional power or secure trade routes. This kind of support strengthens the SAF's ability to fight the RSF. Russia. Shifted position, Red Sea trade influence, and maritime military advantages. Although Wagner, Russian mercenaries, initially appeared to support the RSF, by mid-2024, Russia was reported as having shifted to support the SAF, or at least the state side, because Russia's strategic aim of securing a naval base in Port Sudan requires a government ally rather than a fragmented rebel force. A state partner would give Russia long-term legal and security guarantees, and controlling or influencing the Red Sea coast would give Russia a strategic maritime advantage. By aligning with the SAF, Russia hopes to secure more predictable access. For the SAF, this shift offers a boost in heavy military support and a major external patron: China, trade, pipelines, ports, railways, the Belt and Road Initiative. China has been one of Sudan's major trading and investment partners, especially in the oil, infrastructure, and construction sectors. Its involvement is often framed in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, and securing stable trade routes, infrastructure, ports, pipelines, railways, and access to resources. According to a 2024 study, China's foreign policy approach in Sudan has been driven by both strategic, securing material interest, stability, and reputational, global image, non-interference factors. Beijing publicly emphasizes non-interference in the internal affairs of other states and calls for conflict resolution and humanitarian assistance. For example, China's UN representative said that China would continue to provide assistance and humanitarian supplies to Sudan. While China may not publicly declare which side it supports militarily, and its official stance is relatively neutral, there is accumulating evidence that Chinese manufactured arms and equipment have found their way into the war. Investigations have identified Chinese manufactured guide bombs in RSF attacks in North Darfur. The report states these weapons are almost certainly re-exported to the RSF via the UAE. Another source reports that Chinese manufactured weapons are being used by both SAF and RSF, though without a clear breakdown of which side has how many. The Sudanese government has publicly demanded that China act against its technology being used by RSF and hold those responsible to account, accusing the RSF and the UAE of enabling such transfers. China has denied direct involvement in supplying arms to the RSF. For example, China's chargé d'affaires in Sudan stated China had no relationship with the RSF. This has led to suspicions of double dealing or even conspiracy. China's interest in a stable Sudan align with supporting the state apparatus, the SAF, in maintaining control and ensuring infrastructure and investment interests aren't subjected to complete collapse. China has strong incentives to back the SAF indirectly through economic investment, reconstruction, and infrastructure because disruption threatens its interests. China might tactically allow or turn a blind eye to arms flows or re-exports of Chinese equipment that strengthen the SAF, even if not overtly acknowledged. But publicly, China is cautious. It emphasizes humanitarian assistance and mediation rather than overt military involvement. China's direct support for RSF is not clearly documented, and China officially denies supplying the RSF. However, Chinese manufactured weapons are documented in RSF hands via third-party transfers, for example, through the UAE, which implicates Chinese origin. So while China may not be the immediate supplier, its armament industry is indirectly involved. This means China's weapon industry benefits financially, and by extension, China's strategic reach is extended, albeit indirectly. China, nonetheless, differentiates its official relationships because China's official policy emphasizes non-interference. Beijing is cautious about being perceived as choosing sides in internal conflicts. The fact that Chinese arms reach both sides means China retains flexibility. Whichever side eventually prevails, China's equipment is there, and China's investments remain relevant. China's leverage is if it pushes for a peace or settlement, it can propose itself as a mediator via its diplomatic standing and protector of economic interest. Indeed, some have argued China is well positioned to be a peace broker in Sudan, but China must also manage reputational risk. It can't be seen as arming parties in a conflict with large humanitarian damages to its global image, especially given earlier criticisms during the Darfur crisis. The study, Wang 2024, notes this tension. What China is doing, investing heavily in Sudan's economy, oil, infrastructure, trade, thus tying its interests to stability, supplying or allowing the supply of Chinese manufactured weapons directly or indirectly that are in use by both SAF and RSF, and sending humanitarian assistance and publicly calling for peace while preserving diplomatic neutrality, using its status to potentially broker or influence peace efforts in Sudan. What China is not doing, publicly declaring large-scale military support to one side, SAF, or formally align with RSF, taking the lead militarily or publicly in the conflict, unlike some other powers, nor fully controlling the arms flows of its manufactured equipment once exported or re-exported. This ambiguity allows plausible deniability. The United States of America, Horn of Africa, Red Sea influence, trade routes, natural resources, and military logistics. The U.S. has strategic interest in Sudan tied to a broader regional stability in the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea corridor. The U.S. also doesn't want to leave this region to its competitors, for example, Russia, China, and the Gulf states. So part of its involvement is about preventing rival powers from gaining unchallenged influence. The U.S. has long viewed Sudan through the ends of regional control rather than a humanitarian concern. Sudan's geographic position in the Red Sea gives it strategic importance for global shipping routes, military logistics, and surveillance. The U.S. seeks to prevent rival states from establishing bases there while maintaining indirect influence through allies like Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Sudan's natural resources, gold, uranium, oil, and agricultural exports are another point of U.S. interest. By leveraging sanctions and trade restrictions, Washington indirectly shapes which global actors can access these resources. Officially, the U.S. presents its involvement as humanitarian, promoting democracy and civilian rule, but its history in Sudan shows a recurring pattern of instrumentalizing crises policies for strategic and economic advantage. The U.S. helped design the post-2019 transitional framework that gave the military, SAF and RSF, disproportionate power in Sudan's governance, a structure that directly collapsed into war in 2023. Washington co-led the Jeddah ceasefire talks with Saudi Arabia, but critics argue they legitimize both warlords without addressing the arms flows or financial systems sustaining them. U.S. intelligence agencies have long maintained back-channel relationships with Sudanese military officials for so-called counter-terrorism cooperation, a legacy of post-9/11 policy that blurred lines between security coordination and complicity in repression. U.S. sanctions policy towards Sudan, active since 1997, crippled the formal economy and pushed Sudan's elites towards smuggling, militarization, and paramilitary finance networks. These same networks now sustain the SAF and RSF. While publicly condemning the conflict, Washington continues to supply arms to regional partners like Egypt, UAE, and Saudi Arabia, who funnel weapons, fuel, and funds to opposing sides in Sudan. The U.S. has not sanctioned the UAE or Egypt, though, despite clear evidence of their role in arming the RSF and SAF, respectively, revealing the double standard of selective enforcement. It's like the United States deliberately engages in the destabilization of entire regions, creating the very conditions that give rise to terrorism. Then, when chaos ensues, the U.S. government turns around and uses some of those crises to justify more wars, manufacturing public consent for endless military intervention. Meanwhile, these perpetual wars serve one primary purpose: to enrich the billionaire class that grows fat and powerful from the blood and sacrifice of our sons and daughters who are sent to die in conflicts that should have never happened in the first place. Back home, ordinary Americans struggle in poverty and hardship, while the wealthy elite funnel our hard-earned tax dollars, the literal product of our blood, sweat, and tears, into a toxic cycle of war profiteering. This is the military-industrial complex at work, a system built on depravity, inhumanity, and ruthless exploitation of human lives across the globe. But let's continue. The U.S. remains one of Sudan's top aid donors, but much of that assistance is channeled through U.S. contracted NGOs and international agencies, keeping funding under American influence. Critics argue that humanitarian aid is used to leverage policy concessions, tying food and medical assistance to cooperation with U.S.-aligned political frameworks. The U.S. continues to recognize General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and the SAF as the official government despite the military's own record of atrocities, including airstrikes on Khartoum civilians. The truth is, both the SAF and RSF are drenched in blood, and the chaos only serves the superpowers. The US, Russia, and China all exploit the conflict to protect the power, influence, and profits of their oligarchs. The U.S. military coordination with Egypt, the SAF's primary external backer, effectively supports SAF operations through intelligence sharing and logistics. While Washington has sanctioned some SAF-linked companies, it has stopped short of targeting the leadership and avoiding measures that could disrupt U.S. relations with Cairo or Riyadh. On the other hand, the U.S. formally declared RSF actions in Darfur as genocide, as sanctioned by Hemeti's gold trading networks. However, much of the RSF's weaponry originates from UAE stockpiles filled with U.S.-made systems, illustrating how Washington's own arms exports indirectly but likely intentionally, feeds the paramilitary side it condemns. The U.S. claims it has moral authority, but shows it has selective accountability. It condemns atrocities while maintaining defense contracts with the very governments arming Sudan's belligerents. By structuring Sudan's post-Bashir transition around military power sharing, Washington inadvertently cemented the SAF-RSF rivalry that exploded into civil war. Sanctions against Sudan have a dual effect. They isolate the government while driving it toward alternative patrons like Russia or Iran, thereby perpetuating the cycle of proxy wars. U.S. peace efforts often serve to maintain influence, ensuring continued Western access to the Red Sea, not to end violence. What the U.S. is doing, providing humanitarian aid while using it as diplomatic leverage, imposing selective sanctions on RSF and SAF-linked businesses, maintaining close military ties with Egypt and Saudi Arabia, both key players in Sudan's war, and publicly denouncing atrocities while sustaining economic and arms relationships with those indirectly fueling them. What the USA is not doing, confronting the role of its allies in prolonging the war, halting its own weapons exports that empower regional belligerents, offering consistent civilian-led reconstruction support unlinked to Western strategic priorities, nor taking responsibility for policy decisions that militarize Sudan's post-revolution landscape. Final thoughts. The war in Sudan is not merely a domestic power struggle between the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, RSF. It is a mirror reflecting the competing ambitions of powerful external actors whose involvement has deepened and prolonged the conflict. Egypt's military and logistical backing of the SAF stems from its desire to control the Nile corridor and secure its southern border, while the United Arab Emirates finances and arms the RSF through gold trading networks to expand its regional influence and access to Sudan's mineral wealth. Saudi Arabia walks a delicate line, funding humanitarian initiatives while quietly supporting the SAF to maintain stability along the Red Sea. Turkey, Iran, and Russia have each sought to use Sudan to expand their strategic footprints. Turkey through defense exports, Iran through drone and surveillance support, and Russia first via Wagner's gold mining and later through alignment with the SAF to secure a naval base at Port Sudan. China's involvement is primarily economic, anchored in infrastructure investment and arms manufacturing, but its exports and trade indirectly sustain both warring sides. The United States positions itself as a peace broker, yet its long record of militarization, sanctions, and proxy alliances makes it deeply complicit in Sudan's ongoing tragedy and genocide. The United States cannot be absolved of complicity. Decades of sanctions, selective diplomacy, and arms sales to its regional allies have helped militarize Sudan's politics and sustain the war economy. By continuing to arm and finance partners such as Egypt and the UAE, both directly involved in the fighting, Washington's hands are bloodied alongside with those of the powers it criticizes. Together, these external actors have transformed Sudan into a proxy battleground where global rivalries eclipse the suffering of its people. The ongoing devastation is not only the product of Sudanese factionalism, but of an international system that treats fragile nations as chessboards for power. While Sudanese generals pull the triggers, foreign powers load the guns, until the global patrons who arm, fund, and exploit both the SAF and the RSF withdraw their influence. peace in Sudan will remain an illusion. Thanks for listening. Please visit our webpage if you would like to get access to all the resources for this presentation. I highly recommend it. Many people have reached out and said that they are unfamiliar with the genocide in Sudan. So that's why I put this presentation together. And if you click on those resources, many of which are scholarly and peer-reviewed and credible, you should be able to get a good idea about this horrific atrocity. I will put a link to my webpage article in the description for this video. Thank you.